Hey, we're here with Tom Oscherwitz, who is the Chief Privacy Officer of ID Analytics, which is a provider of ID risk services. We're chatting here in the SE Magazine offices today. Tom, welcome.
Thanks
for joining us.
Nice to see you.
Now, we were discussing, when we're thinking about data breaches, a lot of times we're thinking about this whole concept of credit monitoring as a result of a breach. But there's something to be said for identity monitoring as well. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, there's two different technologies that I think are interesting. One is called identity monitoring, where you evaluate the identity of an individual for the misuse of that information. It doesn't rely on credit bureau reports, but it relies on other sources of information. And it looks for misuse of that identity. There's also a concept called data breach monitoring, where you can look at the data itself and evaluate whether or not that data breach caused misuse of that identity.
Mm-hmm. So tell me, are a lot of organizations going this route after a breach happens? And then I know you were mentioning even before a breach happens to kind of get ahead of the game in case something might happen.
Right. Data breach analysis is becoming more intriguing to organizations as they look for new ways to respond to breaches. Credit monitoring was and is a solution that was ready-made when breaches came up in 2004, but there are some limitations, and what data breach analysis can do is give organizations insight into whether or not data is being misused.
We also were discussing, and I know you guys probably have a lot of information on this, relating to how organized these fraud rings have gotten after these breaches happen, right? So can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. We would divide fraud rings into four key categories. First, there are what I would call lifestyle fraud rings. These are folks who have an ordinary level of income, but they want something more, maybe a new car, and so they use fraud to supplement their activity. There's also opportunistic fraud rings, who are folks that have access to sensitive data, perhaps a caregiver or somebody else like that, and they use this access to start organizing a fraud ring. There's also what I would call career fraud rings or occupational fraud rings, or people who are full-time using this to supplement or create income for themselves. But perhaps the most disturbing and serious trend is what I would call enterprise fraud rings.
And we've seen those growing?
Yeah, it's certainly one of the things that we've seen is that enterprise fraud rings are capitalizing on the availability of the internet. Recently in Minnesota, for example, there was a fraud ring with several hundred individuals, and this fraud ring was incredibly well organized. They had executive leadership councils, they had middle managers, they had data collectors. So
it's being run like an actual enterprise.
Absolutely correct. Somebody once said
they probably have personal information they need to protect, right? They might have a chief privacy officer.
Oh, well, I was going to say they're like a corporation, except they probably don't have a general counsel or a privacy officer.
Mm-hmm. It's unbelievable. The thing to learn out of that for these organizations is protect your data, because these criminals are getting so slick with using it that they want to go after it so that they can put it to use in this way, right?
Yeah, absolutely correct. And one of the things we're seeing now is a trend in terms of data that it used to be when organizations thought about data, they had known risks. They were worried about trade secrets. They were worried about internal misuse of data. But now the modern enterprise really needs to think about data from a 360-degree perspective. Not only just worry about your misuse of the data or internal misuse, but what are regulators thinking? What is the impact of data harms to consumers? You really need, as an organization, to think about the entire environment in thinking about risk. And
you were saying before we went on camera, the notion of data breach is changing, in that back several years ago we thought of it as only credit card information, social security card information, etc. And what criminals might use that. But now, from a consumer standpoint, they're also concerned about just privacy alone, right? They just don't want their information, their medical information, for example, getting out there, right?
Yeah, regulators are becoming more aware of the impact of data held by organizations and what that has on consumers. So traditionally, as you were saying, identity fraud was the first target for data breach notification laws. But we're seeing now in the state of California and federal legislation, really across the country, that people are now focusing on loss and misuse of data across the board, including privacy.
Mm-hmm. Tom Oscherwitz, good insight on the data breach front here and also on the fraud front. So scary stuff out there. One final word for organizations, what should they be doing?
I think one of the things that we've learned these days is that you really need to focus on using analytics and decisioning to improve your processes.
Mm-hmm. From a risk standpoint.
Exactly right.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you guys again soon.